Okay, so I'm here with Alvin Goldman, and he's the Board of Governors Professor of Philosophy and Cognitive Science at Rutgers. And I'm Jennifer Lackey, and I'm an Associate Professor at Northwestern University, and we're here to talk about social epistemology. So Alvin, did you want to get started?
Okay, so social epistemology is a topic that's been getting more and more attention in the last decade or so. And there are books entitled Social Epistemology. There's at least one journal devoted to social epistemology. So it seems reasonable to ask, what is this thing called social epistemology? And what its historical background is. And then look at some particular examples of social epistemology and mull them over. So I'm going to start out. Is that our idea, Jennifer?
That sounds
I'll start out.
That sounds like a good plan.
Okay, so I'll start out with some background, partly historical background on social epistemology, and then look at what might be the nature of the beast.
Okay.
So, I suppose we should start with the most historically important figure in the history of epistemology, and that's Descartes. Mm-hmm. And everybody agrees that Descartes' idea of epistemology, which has been enormously influential, is very individualistic. So he started with the idea that to explore the nature of the world and acquire knowledge, we need to start in our own minds, and we need to explore, think about how we can use our mind and the contents of the mind as the basis for learning everything else we were going to learn. So this is a very individualist conception which has largely pervaded epistemology since Descartes wrote in the 17th century. Mm-hmm. But are there other examples of epistemology that aren't so completely individualistic? Well, you can find some examples starting way back in the ancients with Plato, going into the moderns to Hume and Reid, and taking other kinds of figures like Marx. So let me just give a few of these examples very briefly. So Plato in the Charmides asked or worried about, or had Socrates worry about the question of whether he could tell who among the people who claims to be an expert on a certain subject really is an expert, and whether one should rely on that person intellectually for their expertise. But he found that a difficult question. But at any rate, Socrates was thinking, well, I can get help from the experts if they really are experts. So he seemed to be thinking about the idea of getting help from others, which is already social. Mm-hmm. And then in the 18th and 19th centuries, in small portions of their epistemologies, you have Hume and Reid both talking in different ways about relying on other people, and saying that we do rely a lot on other people, and in particular on their testimony. So they had different theories about when we're entitled to trust somebody else's testimony, but the idea of trusting other people's word or testimony is obviously a social epistemological idea.
Of course, I mean, Hume being, Hume is obviously still in keeping with Descartes' view of epistemology in general, though. I mean, we'll get to that when we talk about testimony, but certainly these historical figures are more or less individualistic as well.
True. And then we'll have to worry about whether contemporary social epistemology, to what extent it continues to have some individualistic basis, and so is continuous with that historical tradition, or breaks away a little bit more radically from that basis. Right. In various ways. So Marx had perhaps a different idea. Maybe this is a more social idea. So he had, of course, the famous idea that people's views, at least on matters that have to do with political topics and other things, were very much influenced by one's niche in society, and in particular economic niche in society and the class that one belonged to. But he also held that your class views were ideological, and by this he meant to connote, and his followers meant to connote, that it was a distortion of the facts that were influenced by your particular class position in society. So this was a kind of epistemological idea, sort of diagnosing these distortions, that is, intellectual errors, as coming from these social class influences. So that's a rather different idea, but I think, although he didn't, and maybe his followers didn't so much call it epistemology, it really was kind of an epistemological idea. Does that seem plausible?
I mean, I think that there are different ways of understanding epistemology. I mean, I wouldn't really fight over who gets the term. But I mean, I think broadly construed, I mean, I think it certainly is not, I mean, I think it would be fine to consider that broadly epistemological.
Because it has to do with belief formation, at least this is what I'm thinking. It has to do with belief formation, and it's the sources of belief formation, and also the source of errors in your belief formation.
Right.
I mean, we might not agree with Marx about this, of course, but the question here is simply whether this idea was, in some sense, an epistemological idea, which wasn't, of course, so much the label that he or his followers gave it.
Right,
But it might be considered in that light.
Right.
So let me say some things now about a more recent movement, which many philosophers would consider rather radical and radically false, and didn't go so much by the name of social epistemology, but might be thought of, in some people's ears, they might hear social epistemology, they might hear these kinds of movements suggested to them. And I have in mind movements in postmodernism and in social studies of science and social construction of this or that. So you had ideas in the 70s and 80s, maybe more associated with certain kinds of humanists and certain kinds of social scientists, but at least some philosophers, like Richard Rorty in particular. And although they didn't generally call themselves social epistemologists, you might say that their ideas did have a strong epistemological focus, but in many ways they were aimed at putting an end to epistemology as it had been considered before. And Rorty in particular spoke about the death of epistemology, or the replacement of epistemology by different ideas. So one idea here was the idea that truth or facts, even scientific facts, are really just social constructions. There aren't facts like we think or that scientists think, but that what they call scientific facts are really just the social construction of certain statements in science, and then the acceptance of those statements. So Bruno Latour and Steve Wohlgar in the late 70s published a book called, I think it was Laboratory Life, the Social Construction of Scientific Facts. And what they did, they went into a laboratory, and this is the kind of thing sociologists of science have done, and they studied exactly the way scientists do their work, what happens there. And they said, oh, well, they have this equipment, and some of this equipment prints out certain results from these experiments, and then these are they're inscriptions, and these are statements, and then they talk about this stuff, and they write up inscriptions, and they exchange these inscriptions, so they write other people in other laboratories, and they publish articles, and it's all a lot of statements. And then after a while, certain of these statements get widely accepted. And once they get widely accepted and not even questioned anymore, then, according to Latour and Wohlgar, some facts have been constructed. Now, it's not really, they claim, that they've discovered, that the facts aren't out there in the world, like the scientists say, or that we might want to say. They're not really out there in the physical world. They're just social constructions, which the sociologists, that's the secret that these sociologists take themselves to have discovered. So, but the whole idea of facts as existing outside of us is a mistake and is to be replaced by this sociologized thing. So instead of the idea that I think pervades historical and contemporary epistemology, the idea of epistemology is for us to pursue the facts. And the facts are there independent of us and independent of our beliefs. They were claiming, oh no, they're really just constructed from our beliefs.
Now,
they're just the consensus view of people.
Now, why would this be considered social epistemology rather than something like social metaphysics or social philosophy of language or something like that?
Well, I agree with you. I agree with you that it probably should be called something like that. But you know, as you mentioned at the beginning, I also have an appointment in cognitive science, and I was at a cognitive science-y venue where somebody who's really a neuroscientist was talking the history of science. And he was raising various questions about why certain people get to be have their ideas accepted right away, and other people don't get their ideas accepted right away, but later on we realized they were very important. And certain questions came up during the Q&A session, and I said, well, here I think we need to turn to social epistemology. And everybody looked at me as if I was some strange creature, and what kind of crazy beast was I bringing into discussion? Now, nobody exactly said this, but I don't think these people know anything about the current movements in philosophical social epistemology. So I suspect that they thought I was thinking about these postmodern movements, which aren't any more popular in those circles than mine. So I thought in their ears, what I was talking about by the label social epistemology was this kind of stuff, which they didn't even want to hear about. Now that's speculation on my part, but I think that's what some people think social epistemology is, not philosophers who are up to date, but other kinds of people. So I think, and there is a journal called Social Epistemology,
Right.
which, after all, is very much invested in the movement of social studies of science, and very much the product of people who have social constructivist ideas. So that maybe is, I should have skipped the earlier comment. I mean, I think that's enough reason to think that in some people's terminology, that's what social epistemology is. So we have to. So I'm talking about this to differentiate, to set that off from what we're later going to talk about is a better conception of social epistemology, which is where I think most of us philosophers are at now. A more objectivist conception of social epistemology. So this first conception I would call a debunking conception of social epistemology. So really, as you say, it maybe shouldn't even be considered social epistemology. Maybe it's better called a social debunking of epistemology. Because it would be a debunking, first of all, of objectivist notions of truth or fact, and it would also be very much a debunking of objectivist notions of rationality. So an important paper in this same body of literature very much wanted to criticize the idea of an objective or universal conception of rationality, and to replace it with the idea there are just local conceptions of rationality. So I think the idea there is that instead of what most epistemologists take at least as a default, I mean, of course it can be discussed and critically examined, but taken as the presumption or default that there is an objective set of norms, of right norms of how we should form beliefs or degrees of belief, and what would give us justification. And there are facts about when we're justified, objective facts about when a person is justified or unjustified. It doesn't mean it's easy to find out whether you yourself are justified or whether somebody else is justified, but there is a fact of the matter. And the job of epistemology is to understand, well, what's the underlying basis for those facts? Would you agree that that's what most working epistemologists sort of take at least as a working assumption?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, people in kind of contemporary analytic epistemology, I think that that's sort of the guiding framework with which we're all working. Absolutely. Right.
Okay. So I think we're on the same footing. I mean, I think we agree there that that's where mainstream analytic epistemology is located.
Right.
So then I think our question is, so what is social epistemology, and how is it related, I mean, as part of mainstream epistemology, and how is it related to individual epistemology?
Right.
So that's at least how I approach the subject. And I think knowing your work, that you do too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're on the same page here, Alvin.
Okay. So let me then turn to the question of, so what is social epistemology? And I'm going to propose a sort of little taxonomy of what social epistemology might be.
Okay.
And parts of it will be closer to traditional epistemology, and some parts of it would be further from traditional epistemology, but all would be connected in a unifying, underlying way with the tradition, but would depart in some parts from the tradition. So the first part would, like, standard epistemology, standard individual epistemology, would start with the assumption that what the epistemologist studies is the activities, or intellectual activities at least, of individual agents. And what an individual agent does in the intellectual realm is, in pursuing the truth, try to find out and believe what the truth is, and try to avoid believing what's false. And use good procedures or good methods in order to study these things. That was Descartes' one of Descartes' books, of course, was about proper method, right? So that's what we're still talking about.
Right.
What are proper methods, and what are proper, and what is good evidence, and things like that. So I would call this individual doxastic agent epistemology, and that's pretty much what all traditional epistemology is about. But it can be given a social twist if the kind of evidence, or part of the evidence that an individual agent uses, is social evidence. So what might be meant by social evidence? So social evidence would be things that other people say or think. And that if you're the agent, the epistemic or doxastic agent that we're focusing on as epistemologists, and if you come to believe something by consulting other people, by hearing what they say, and they say, for example, that they observe such and so, or whatever they say, you hear what they say, and then you form your belief either completely on the basis of what they said, or partly on the basis of what they said. So that's what would be an example of using social evidence.
Now, on this picture, I mean, just to clarify, I mean, we're going to talk about testimony a little bit later in the discussion, but I mean, on this picture, on a Humean picture of testimony, where I need to use my own individual resources to justify the testimony. So you might tell me something, but I'm only justified in accepting what you tell me if I myself have, the appropriate reasons grounded in my more basic faculties like sense perception, memory, and reason. That's what's doing the justificatory work. Are you still calling that social evidence, even if ultimately it is kind of bottoms out epistemically in my own individual resources?
Well, that's the way I'm thinking of it. That is, I think if somebody were asked, well, what is your evidence for believing P? And your evidence was that Joan said so, and blah, 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 but that's part of your evidence, that Joan said so, then that's my evidence. It's maybe not all of my evidence, and it's not the bottom part of my evidence on Hume's view.
At least on a really strong Humean picture, it's supposed to be presumably epistemological reductionism. So if we really do understand that as a reductionist view, it's not even really partly based on my testimony. I mean, not many people actually even hold such a view. But I do think that it's worth kind of thinking about, because on a very strong Humean picture, if it is in fact reduction taking place, then the testimonial reduction is actually being reduced to the justification of sense perception, memory, and inductive inference.
Well, that's what an epistemologist can say if you're of a Humean persuasion. But if somebody was in court and was testifying as a witness, or maybe even as a participant in the event that the court is the legal case is focusing on, and the person says, well, I did such and such because I thought that such and such was the case, and I had credible evidence for believing that such and such was the case. And then the lawyer for the other side says, well, what was your evidence for believing that anyway? I said, well, Jones told me that, and I've known Jones for years, so of course I relied on what he said. So, I was a rational person. I was acting in good faith and forming my beliefs in good faith. I was a rational person because I had evidence, namely his telling me this, for believing that. So, don't you think the jurors would think, well, yes, you had evidence for that. Now, we're not going to do a philosophical theory about what that evidence is ultimately based on at its epistemological roots, but you're well within your rights in saying, yeah, my evidence comes from Jones.
Yeah, I guess if we were being, like I said, really strict here, I guess it's just unclear to me that would, on a reductionist picture, whether it is, whether we really would want to call that social evidence. Obviously, in a broader sense, I think it's fine to call it social evidence. There's a sense in which all testimony might be regarded very broadly as social evidence. But I do think that given the different kinds of views of testimonial justification, you're going to end up with radically different conceptions of social evidence, some of which look not social at all.
Okay, what do you think about this, Jennifer? Let's turn to another topic in the contemporary treatment of social epistemology, namely the famous problem of peer disagreement. Mm-hmm. So I'm not really so much interested exactly in whether that person is a peer, but so I would consider this in the same first branch that I've started to sketch as testimony, except the main thing here is that the other person believes it. Now, you could think that the other person believes it even if that person didn't testify to you. You could have heard it from somebody else, right? Mm-hmm. So it isn't that person's testifying to you. But if you think that somebody else believes the opposite of what you do, then most people think, well, you ought to at least seriously reflect on whether that ought to affect your own opinion of the subject, now that you've learned that other person thinks the opposite of you on that question. Now, we don't have to decide whether Hume was right about testimony, and so we don't even have to worry about the source of testimony. As long as you think the other person has a different view, even if you're not justified in believing that the person has another view, but you do believe that the person has another view, we can ask, well, what should you do in light of that belief of yours that that person has the opposite view? Don't you think that it would be reasonable of you then to think further? So that's a problem in social epistemology, I'm saying.
Right. I'm not disputing that testimony, certainly I of all people would think that testimony belongs under the heading of social epistemology.
I'm glad you make that point.
No, absolutely. I was only, and maybe it's just a minor point, but I was really just wondering, so you were, giving your taxonomy and you were saying that there's an individual doxastic agent epistemology. But so within that individual doxastic agent epistemology, one thing that might make it increasingly social is if we're relying on social evidence.
Right.
And I guess that was where I was just wondering whether that's, I think that the taxonomy, I can understand why we might call any testimonial basis for our beliefs, social evidence. Mm-hmm. But I guess I thought that it was worth bringing up that there's really a spectrum of what we might mean by social evidence there, ranging from, like a non-reductionist, for instance, might say that we rely on testimony just like we rely on sense perception, and that sounds incredibly social to me. We're basically saying social agents are as epistemologically basic to our lives as our sight is. Well, and on the other end of the spectrum, you have like a really strong Humean who is saying not at all. So I guess I'm just saying that I think that the term social evidence really might conceal a lot of important differences. And of course, you're just giving a taxonomy here. Yeah. But I do think that when, if you're really interested in the question of social epistemology, whether or not evidence is social, I think that there's, like I said, I just think that there's a big spectrum
No doubt, no doubt. And look, we could accommodate what you're proposing in the following way by saying that if you're Humean, then there isn't any basic social evidence that you can have.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then we could decide, I mean, in two ways in terms of a taxonomy. One would be that social evidence has to be basic in order to be counted as part of social epistemology, or it's okay if it's social evidence that it be non-basic in order to be considered part of social epistemology.
Right.
And you could go either way on that.
Yeah. No, that sounds good.
Okay, so and just to go back to our historical example, so when Plato in his dialogue, the Charmides, had Socrates inquire and worry about whether the people claiming to be experts were really experts. So that was kind of, I would think of that as falling into the first category of social epistemology that we've just been discussing. So the question is whether to rely on others or particular others, and then that falls into relying on the evidence of what other people say and choosing between the particular others that you're willing or unwilling to rely upon. Mm-hmm. So he, so at least depending on how we settle that taxonomical issue, certainly might be possible that he was, raising questions for social epistemology. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so but there's another branch, and in my little taxonomy, it would be the second branch of social epistemology, which would be more of a departure from traditional epistemology, and I'm not really sure who in the history of epistemology might have taken positions in this branch. So this branch talks about a different kind of agent. Instead of an individual person or believer who forms beliefs and sometimes suspends judgments and so forth, it would be a social entity that is taken to have something like beliefs, or at least intentional attitudes toward propositions. Sometimes people talk about making judgments. So this is the sort of thing we, in everyday discourse, talk about. We talk about, well, the team is confident that it will win. And it's this whole team, a bunch of players, and they're confident, but confident that they're going to win, so it's about a factual matter. So it looks like, the way we describe it at least, verbally, it looks like some group entity is forming a belief or taking a posture, a doxastic posture toward a proposition, namely, we will win. If you accept that premise, that working premise, and are willing to talk about group or collective epistemic agents, then there's a question of what is rational for such agents to do, or when such agents have knowledge, when they're justified, all the kinds of questions that mainstream epistemology usually asks about individuals can then be asked about groups, and that would be the kind of enterprise that would constitute the second branch of social epistemology. What do you think about that?
Well, obviously, I mean, I'm gonna, later on, I mean, I had, various things I could say about the about collective epistemology. I guess I myself am not sure that I would put it in terms of being collective epistemic agents in that particular sort of way. I mean, I think that collective epistemology is broadly interested in epistemological issues that center around groups or collective entities. And I wouldn't want to attribute to everyone who's working in collective epistemology the view that there can even be collective agents in, like a robust sense of that word. I mean, certainly we attribute knowledge, we attribute belief, we do attribute agency to collective entities, I think, all the time in common discourse.
And allow me to add, and in legal discourse. So
Absolutely.
Corporations are recognized by the law, right?
Absolutely.
And as taking actions and so on.
Absolutely. But I mean, I think that it's a further question. I mean, interestingly, in the law, I think that at least in certain branches of it with respect to certain doctrines, they're highly individualistic in the way that they understand what it means to be a collective agent or to have collective responsibility. So, for instance, in the law, there's this doctrine called the collective knowledge doctrine. And the collective knowledge doctrine was actually introduced into the law to deal with cases where some of the already existing doctrines wouldn't be sufficient for holding, let's say, a corporation or some other kind of collective entity responsible. So there's already, it's already very easy to deal in the law with a case where one single employee, let's say, of a company has all of the requisite knowledge needed to satisfy the mens rea or the intent needed for the crime. So they just say that there's vicarious responsibility. If you're a business or you're a company and one of your employees has all of the requisite information to know that it was wrong, they knew that it was, they knew what they were doing, then the company kind of vicariously is responsible for the action. But the collective knowledge doctrine, and so that's obviously a very individualistic way of looking at collective responsibility, right? They're saying so long as one individual member of this collective entity has the requisite information or the requisite intent, so too does the company vicariously. So that's a very individualistic way of looking at it. And
does that individual have to occupy or possess certain powers that are conferred on him or her by the corporation?
No. So, for instance, so the collective knowledge doctrine was introduced into the law to deal with a case, the sort of case like this. Okay, these aren't going to be. I'm going to kind of abstract away from some of the details, but the collective knowledge doctrine says that we can hold a collective entity. We can hold them responsible and say that they had collective knowledge, even if no single individual member of that entity has the knowledge in question. Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is quite different from vicarious responsibility, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. So this is actually one of the more, in a way, social aspects of the law. And there's lots of people who disagree with the collective knowledge doctrine. They think mm-hmm. it's legal scholars who think that it's actually quite unjust to have this collective knowledge doctrine. But the idea is supposed to be, so one instance in which the collective knowledge doctrine arose was a case in which, the original case was this case of case against the Bank of New England. And it was a case where there is an act that says that you cannot cash a check for over $10,000 for cash without filling out this form. And this, person went into the bank and he repeatedly gave multiple checks for under $10,000, but which added up to be well over $10,000. So one check for $8,500, one check for $9,000, and so on and so forth. And so the employee knew that the customer was cashing all of these checks. Another employee of the bank, another person who was higher up, knew that these transactions needed to be filed, needed to be filled out. And yet another employee of the bank knew that if you added up the checks together and they were over $10,000, then you needed to fill out the act. So no single employee of the bank actually knew all of the relevant information to satisfy intent. Uh-huh. And so the collective knowledge doctrine was introduced because they were saying, actually, as a collective entity, the Bank of New England knew. And some people think that this is outrageous. This is just an absolutely outrageous thing to say, that the entity itself knew knowledge by simply adding up bits of knowledge that each member of the collective entity knows. But it's a radically different conception. I mean, most other doctrines in the law are actually quite individualistic in dealing with these sorts of cases. Like I said, as for instance, vicarious responsibility, which is really saying is so long as one employee. So in Bank of New England, if that one employee knew everything, knew about the act, knew that if you had more than one check, it qualified for having to fill out this form, and knew that the customer was coming in and bringing all these checks, the collective knowledge doctrine wouldn't have even needed to be introduced because
there was a single employee. But it's precisely in these sorts of cases where there's not a single person who has all of the knowledge that the collective knowledge doctrine is supposed to kick in. But there's all sorts of questions about whether this makes sense, whether it's legal, whether it's just to have. I mean, so for example, the reason the collective knowledge doctrine was introduced into the law, I think originally was to try to prevent deliberate compartmentalization of knowledge.
Right.
Okay. So like a classic example is where, a corporation set itself up.
Right.
So that knowledge was compartmentalized. Employees were not talking to each other, and this was enabling them to get away with criminal activity.
Right.
Okay. But I think the relevant question is, the collective knowledge doctrine does not distinguish between deliberate compartmentalization and accidental compartmentalization. And so do we think both of these are, do we think that these should be treated exactly the same? And do we think that it makes sense to say that the collective entity knows, even though no single individual knows? So I think these are all, really interesting questions in the collective, when we're talking about a collective epistemology, because some people, their notion of what it is to be a collective agent is extremely individualistic, right? It's just that there's this company and one member of the company, knows that P.
Yeah. Well, but there are lots of contexts in which people want to talk about the collective entity. So, for example, after 9/11, many Americans wanted to know what the FBI knew about these terrorists. Mm-hmm. And, of course, individual agents knew certain things, but they didn't get put together. But the question was, what did the FBI know and what should it have known? So they're talking about the collective, ostensibly, and saying that the collective should have had some knowledge, or at least that's how it seems superficially.
Well, superficially, of course, but I mean, if we're talking non-superficially and actually doing, epistemology or doing philosophy, I guess the point is that if we say that this branch of social epistemology is interested in collective epistemic agents, some people might think that there aren't really collective epistemic agents.
Well, suppose we just said organization, collective epistemic entities, and we didn't call them agents.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Collective
I'm fine with
epistemic
calling
entities.
them just entities. Yeah.
But not agents. Okay.
I think agent is a fairly loaded notion.
That's just a term that is, of course, bandied about. And,
right.
Of course, there's a recent book by Liston Pettit called Group Agency. And they're talking about just this. And they use the term agent, right? Mm-hmm. So some people definitely are willing to use that term.
Right.
Now, other important areas which philosophers of science are talking about have to do with considering science or certain branches or subfields of science, and talking about, and this is something that lay people ask about, well, what does science tell us? I mean, you'll see many popular treatments of scientific topics in which the main question to be addressed is, what does science tell us about X? Well, that looks like they're not talking about some one member, one scientist, and of course the truth of the matter might be, as it usually is, that the scientists aren't completely of one mind, that you can't find any list of propositions that all working people in the field will agree on. There is some there, and yet they want to know, well, but what does science tell us? What can we take away from science? Don't tell me about this individual, that individual. I want to know, how should the public, when it's acting on questions that require scientific information, like many questions that we all face. So what kinds of economic policy decisions are likely to have what effects on the economy? Or what actions by government, or not just national governments, but world governments, would have what effects on climate change, et cetera, et cetera. These are some of the most important topics of our time and our lifetime. I mean, so they want to know often, what does science tell us? Now, maybe that's a bad way. Maybe that's a bad way of formulating. Maybe that's what you want to argue. But on the face of it, people seem to accept this idea.
Well, first of all, I'm not arguing anything. I mean, I'm obviously quite interested in collective epistemology. I'm writing a book on the topic. So I'm definitely interested in the topic. But I think that, first of all, I mean, the question, what does science tell us, I think is a really, it's a strange question, as if the scientific community agrees. I mean, and what does the scientific community pick out? And I mean, so I think there are lots and lots of questions about what does science tell us. I mean, I think that there's a, I think there are a lot of various kinds of questions that we need to in a way parse out of that big question, what does science tell us? But I think that I think my point was that I mean, I don't know, maybe I should talk a little bit more about collective epistemology, since it sounds like we're kind of moving into this area.
Right, let's talk about it.
But I mean, there are
we have been talking about it. Let's proceed.
Yeah, I mean, there are two really quite different approaches in collective epistemology. I mean, and within those approaches, there's lots of different approaches. But there's what's traditionally been called a summative approach and what's traditionally called a non-summative approach. And both of them have lots of different proponents. So a summative approach would say that we can always understand groups in terms of some collection of individuals and relations between those individuals. So, so this is not to say that a group believes that P, if and only if every member believes that P, perhaps not even if most members believe that P, but suppose, for instance, just a certain, kind of set of members who have most of the power or who have most of the decision-making ability, kind of responsibilities, believe that P. But the basic idea is that group belief is somehow always understood in this sort of summative way, where we look at the individuals and we look at the relations between the individuals. The same thing would go for group knowledge, group testimony, that these things can kind of be understood summatively. Group knowledge would be understood in terms of the knowledge possessed by the members of the group, and group testimony would be understood in terms of what a group, what the individuals would testify or do testify to. And now on the non-summative side, these people are really motivated by what they take to be the following possibility. They think that it's pretty obvious that there can be groups that know or believe that P, even if no single member of the group knows or believes that P. So this is really, in a way, taken to be like the central motivating type of case for a non-summative account of group belief or group knowledge. And there are various kinds of cases that they give to support this sort of position. I think they're all quite different sorts of cases, and some I think people might think actually does amount to group belief or group knowledge, and others don't. So for instance, one sort of case might be where a group gets together, they deliberate, and they decide to put out the view that P as their official position, and for various reasons, maybe no members believe it. And I think that the reasons might make a difference as to whether we think the group believes it. I mean, one reason that no members might believe it is, for instance, suppose that we're trying to determine what the safe level of radiation is. Let's say, in the the amount of radiation safe for the public in a given situation. And suppose that you've got half of the scientists asking this question are conservative about the issue, and half of the scientists asking this question are liberal about the position. But they need, as a matter of fact, to put out an answer to the public, or the public will actually be put at greater risk.
Right. So this is something,
the liberals and the conservatives discuss this.
This is something that in a historical context was discussed by John Beatty in the early days, right?
That's right.
In an article about the early days after World War II and the drama.
That's right, exactly. Yeah. So this would be one of those kinds of cases. The liberals, they can't agree, they need to put out a view out there, and so they just decide to compromise. That might be one scenario in which the group believes that P, but no single. But now, of course, lots of people the summativists are just going to, say that doesn't even sound like belief to me. Maybe that's something more like group acceptance or a group view, but it's not group belief. But for the non-summativists, it's these kinds of views that motivate their position. This is what I call these sort of compromise views, where you decide to kind of compromise and put out a view that none of the members believe. Another way in which
here you're describing, I take it, Margaret Gilbert's view, and it's sort of that if people commit themselves to it, at least commit themselves to representing the group view that way, then that's the idea. Am I right?
Yeah. Gilbert has a non-summative view. Yes,
Yeah.
lots of people do. Like Fred Schmidt has a non-summative. There's Deborah Tollefson has a non-summative. So there's lots of non-summativists.
Okay.
Gilbert's not the only one, but she certainly has a non-summativist view.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so the compromise position that you mentioned, Beatty talks about, that's one of these sorts of cases. Another sort of case that Deborah Tollefson talks about is a case where the UN Population Commission issues a report, but the information is really distributed, right? So you're working on the U.S. population on Latinos, another person is working on the U.S. population, and another on the Irish, and so on and so forth, and we're not communicating with each other at all. And so we each issue our particular report. It's put into our little part. It's put into the system, and a report is issued about population in the United States. Here might be another case in which we might say the UN Population Commission knows this about birth rate of Latinos in the United States, let's say. But no single member has that belief because they were just working on their particular part of the report. That might be another kind of case that motivates non-summativism. But I do think that there are, like I said, there are these two quite different approaches in collective epistemology. And for a summativist, the sense in which the collective, the collective entity is a knower or a believer or an agent is a radically different sense in which the collective entity is a knower or a believer or an agent for the non-summativist. And so that's why I was kind of saying that I think that collective epistemology, it can be understood in a quite radical way, and it can be understood in a way that's very, very in keeping with traditional epistemology.
Well, so I see if you're very individualistic about it, then it's very much in keeping with traditional epistemology, you're saying. Okay, but what I meant to be saying was, without settling any of these kinds of issues, you've been discussing, of course, all the different variety of perspectives and stances you could take. So I was just saying, or thinking at any rate, that traditional epistemology, historically speaking, rarely talked about this thing. So it just wasn't very much on the table. Maybe I'm forgetting something or ignorant of something, but I just don't think that historically there was much discussion of this topic, however you want to come out on it. So I meant to be...
Right, no, and I think, I'm not suggesting, let me clarify, I'm not suggesting that this does not belong under social epistemology.
I understand. But you're saying but I do understand you to be saying that some views on the topic would qualify as social, but others would not.
I'm happy to call them all.
Okay.
I'm happy to say they're all doing social epistemology.
Uh-huh.
But I guess what I'm saying is, within social epistemology, there are more or less radical views.
I see.
Of how social the social is, right?
Okay.
So I think that if you're doing collective epistemology, you're doing social epistemology.
All right. Okay, well then we're completely in agreement,
But
at least from a
think,
taxonomical point of view.
Yeah.
But
I
look,
think that it is...
But look, I think we should actually move on to other topics which we thought we would discuss. So would it be all right to move on to the third category that I wanted to propose of social in the taxonomy, and then to say a few words about an example within that area?
What's the third? We were going to talk about testimony. Do we still want to say anything about testimony?
Sure, but I'm thinking about the time and worried that we won't get to any part of social epistemology, to the third branch.
What is the third branch?
Okay, so it's the systems-oriented branch of social
Well, I'll say a
epistemology.
few words about testimony.
Okay.
I think that it's important that we talk a bit about some of the particular areas and so that we have not just a taxonomy, but we talk about what some of the things going on in social epistemology.
Okay, good. Go ahead.
So a lot of work has been done, I think, especially in the last 20 years, in the epistemology of testimony. And there's a range of, I think, important issues that are talked about.
Of which you're a leading contributor.
Well, so we talked briefly, I'll hook it up a little bit with what you had said earlier, that there's the work of David Hume and there's the work of Thomas Reid, who both were working on the epistemology of testimony, but again, in really, different ways socially. So for Reid, he thinks that the testimony is just as epistemologically basic as sense, perception, memory, reason, all of these other basic sources. So really the default position that we should have is the same default position that we have with respect to perception. We don't need to kind of go through any sort of, or so says many standard views, we don't need to go through any sort of inductive reasoning when we are going to trust one of our perceptual experiences. The default position is one of trust. We can just trust what we see, for instance, unless we have reason to question our faculties, or we have reasons to question the actual belief itself. So those would be undercutting and rebutting defeaters. If we have one of those, then we should suspend belief, but otherwise the default position is one of acceptance. And that was Reid's position on testimony. He thinks that testimony is exactly the same. There's no reason to treat it epistemologically different. So obviously if you're a Reidian, and now that view has come to be known in contemporary epistemology as non-reductionism, then you're going to think that we are really indebted to the social world, I think, in a fairly deep and rich sort of way. Testimony is the word of others, relying on people, this sort of dependence that we have on other minds and, the word of others is just as basic in a way as the dependence we have on, trusting our basic faculties like sight and hearing and that sort of thing. On the other hand, you have someone like Hume who thinks that testimony is really different. Testimony is the sort of thing where we actually need to have reasons, positive reasons for trusting it. And we might not need those reasons.
So it's a derivative. It's a source, but only a derivative source that ultimately gets its epistemic power from perception, memory,
from sense, perception, memory, and inductive inference. So I go out in the world, I see I see reports, I hear reports, I correlate them with the facts, I see that there's this regular conjunction, and I inductively infer, oh, Alvin must be reliable. Because when Alvin tells me that P, I go out in the world, I check that P, and I can inductively infer, after I've done this enough, that Alvin is a reliable testifier. So ultimately, my justification for trusting your testimony bottoms out in my own individual resources. So even though I'm happy, like I said, to call that social epistemology, obviously it's social in a far weaker, like you said, more derivative sense. So that's one of the central debates in epistemology, and I think that it does bear on how social epistemology is, because as I said, on the two different views that are the two dominant views.
That is reductionism and anti-reductionism.
Reductionism and non-reductionism. I mean, you have our dependence being, being quite different on those two models.
Right.
And the other central view that is worth mentioning about testimony, the other central debate, is over whether testimonial knowledge, let's just stick with testimonial knowledge. It holds for other epistemic properties like justification or warrant, but let's just stick with knowledge, whether testimony is what's sometimes called a generative epistemic source, or whether it's a merely transmissive epistemic source. So for instance, we might say that, obviously, sense perception is a generative source. It generates brand new knowledge. But testimony is traditionally said to be more like memory, where it doesn't generate brand new knowledge. Memory, for instance, preserves knowledge over time. It doesn't bring into existence new knowledge. It just preserves knowledge that was brought into existence by a generative epistemic source. And testimony is said to be like memory in that it doesn't bring new knowledge into existence. It just transmits knowledge from one speaker to another. So memory preserves knowledge, testimony transmits knowledge. And a principle that falls out of this is that if testimony merely transmits knowledge, then if you know that P on the basis of my testimony, I myself have to know that P.
Right.
Because testimony, as I said, cannot just generate new knowledge.
Right.
And this is a thesis that's been pretty widely accepted in the literature. It definitely goes with the traditional view. It's been challenged by me and by others in recent literature, arguing that there are many cases in which testimony does look like it can function as a generative epistemic source.
Yeah.
And so one such case that I've used a fair bit in my work is the case of a person who's a devout creationist but she's a teacher teaching elementary school, and so she teaches quite reliably. I mean, we can imagine that she goes and she researches her lecture notes, and she gets really reliable lecture notes, and she reliably teaches evolutionary theory to her students. So she asserts Homo sapiens evolved from Homo erectus. She herself doesn't believe it because she's a creationist, so hence she doesn't know it. But I argue that if she's a reliable testifier, she can nonetheless be the source of the children's knowledge. And so that would be a case in which testimony, it looks like, is generating knowledge in the students that the teacher didn't have herself.
Right. So these are obviously fascinating perspectives to explore, and I take it we're not going to debate whether social epistemology is an interesting and intriguing subject matter. Right. So this
That's
is
right.
the testimony is perhaps the most fundamental part of social epistemology, and the one
Right.
that's received the lion's share of attention.
Right, absolutely.
But maybe if we have time, we could turn now to the third branch, as I was starting to talk about earlier, which is rather different, and in my view is, if one accepts this as a legitimate branch of epistemology, and it's been the least explored on the whole, I would say, within epistemology, then that would be a wider departure from the tradition, though I would still argue that it is concerned with some of the same issues that drive traditional epistemology. Questions about how people can get true belief, avoid error, how they can be better positioned to get rational or justified belief. But let's just focus on getting the truth and avoiding error. So, but the idea here is that instead of studying as the target of the epistemologist's investigation, the primary target being either an individual agent or a collective, you don't have to call it an agent if you don't like, but a collective something or other.
Entity.
Entity, yes, entity, thank you. So instead of doing that, we can move to the third branch and talk about social systems of various sort, which are not doxastic or epistemic agents or entities themselves. We don't have to think of them as having beliefs or making judgments, anything like that, but rather they structure some part of the world that we're in, or they just are a part of the world to which we belong and in which we function. And the way that they're either designed or if they've come to be in one way or other, affect our prospects for getting knowledge as individuals. So maybe it's only individuals who have knowledge, but the prospects for individuals getting knowledge may depend heavily on their social environment and their institutional environment. Let's think about the law and parts of the law as an example of this third kind of social epistemology. So the law does a lot of different things. Of course, there are laws that are passed by legislatures. That's not what we're talking about. Here we're going to talk about the enforcement of the law by trials where the law enforces either criminal laws or civil laws and declares as a result of a trial. Of course, there has to be some agency that functions in this mode, but the trial system is instantiated in particular cases by a fact finder, which can be either a jury or a judge or a group of judges, and they come to make a decision of a legal matter, and it's whether or not, say, take the criminal case, whether or not a given individual who's been put forward as a defendant in a case did or did not commit a certain criminal act. Often more than one criminal acts are the subjects of a single trial, but we'll just think about a single criminal act, which is the charge that the criminal prosecutor brings. And then we have a trial. Well, in different societies and in different cultures, there are such things as trials, but they're conducted rather differently. And we might wonder whether these different ways of conducting trials are better or worse from the point of view of getting true verdicts, that is, true in the sense that the verdict is Jones did it, and Jones did, so the verdict is correct, or the verdict is that Jones did it and Jones did not do it. So there's a material fact which would make this verdict in the second case false. And so verdicts are true or false in the material sense. That's a technical use of the term material. And the question is, well, first of all, there's an assumption that the primary aim of criminal trials, and civil trials too for that matter, should be to arrive at accurate verdicts, true verdicts in the material sense, rather than false ones. And then the question is whether the system of holding trials that's in place in a given society as opposed to some other society, or at a given point in time within the same society, because this can change. Trial systems do change over time in small ways or larger ways. So the question is, what's a good way to design a trial system so that the upshot is that there are more true verdicts generated by different actors who take the role of jurors or judges and so on, and produce these verdicts, but we can ask about the system, whether it's a better or worse system than some alternative system that exists elsewhere, or might be contemplated as a replacement by a given society for the future in order to improve its system. So that's
now why is this an importantly different area than the previous one? I mean, why can't we just look at systems as a form of collective entity?
Well, because at least in my conceptualization, the second kind of branch talks about a collective entity which makes judgments, which are like individuals in that it arrives, this collective entity, maybe like a scientific committee or commission, a committee of the National Science Foundation or the National Institutes for Health, or the National Academy of Sciences. They issue judgments which are partly factual or largely factual judgments. So that would be an example of the collective doxastic agent. So I just think that there are many, many systems which provide frameworks, or technologies like our contemporary digital technology. And the question is how, or systems of media under which there are different ways, and there are platforms within those different technologies for exchanging communication, and all of these regimes of communication, and which are not necessarily institutions, but are regimes or systems, and then in other cases they're institutions. So the system of trials in America, which has to be divided into federal system and state systems and so on, which however resemble one another quite a bit, those are adopted in an institutional way, and one can make decisions, and that's what these systems do. They make decisions to have certain rules or different rules, and the question is which ones of those systems and which ones of those rules are better or worse from a truth-getting point of view. And so I'm assuming that the truth-getting point of view is a very epistemological point of view. And there,
no, I have no doubt. I mean, like, I'm not disputing that it's an epistemology. I think I have a broader conception of your second part of your taxonomy. So, I mean, collective entities, I would think, could subsume formal institutions, systems.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that. I think that there are. That's not to say that there. I mean, and I think it's a minor question about taxonomy, and I don't think that there's really clearly a right or wrong answer here. I just think one way of looking at this branch of social epistemology is as kind of collective entities being like this fairly broad notion. Mm-hmm. And then there might be lots and lots and lots of different instances of collective entities, systems being one of them.
Well, here's my, let me put it in terms of your own worries expressed vis-a-vis collective epistemology as I first framed it. So the way I framed it, of course, was that there are collective entities that have doxastic attitudes. Now, if somebody says, I reject that idea completely, then if they didn't have this other branch, then they couldn't do the kind of epistemology which they might be willing to do, because they don't think that these systems, which are not conceived of as doxastic entities that have make judgments or have beliefs or intentional attitudes, they could accept those systems and think that, yeah, it's important to study that branch. There'll only be, for this person, there'll only be 2 branches, but there'll still be this branch that I want to talk about now, in contradistinction to the branch that I called collective doxastic agent social epistemology.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any really substantive issue here. I mean, on my model, this person who rejected collective agents with collective intentional attitudes, would just not do one subsection of
But see, it's very important to realize that epistemologists have hardly touched what I'm calling systems-oriented social epistemology. And the usual way they formulate what epistemology is all about, namely in terms of whether you use the term agent or not, it's something that's forming beliefs or degrees of belief, and it's that stuff that's epistemology. So they would say, oh, the system stuff that you're talking about, that's just off the table. That's just not epistemology. So I'm trying to say, well, it should be epistemology. It should be part of social epistemology. So we shouldn't assimilate it to something different. We shouldn't hide its nature. We should say that it belongs to epistemology because it has to do with influences on the ways belief, accurate or inaccurate, are arrived at, even though the influences themselves are not of a doxastic sort. They're still important to study because they have enormous impact on what people come to believe, on the activities of doxastic agents. So it's very important not to lose sight of them and not to lose sight of their distinctive character, because then you might say, oh, well, I'm just going to leave them aside or throw them out. But you see, I think we have potentially a field, epistemology, which studies things from an epistemic point of view, getting the truth, using rationality or using good methods so as to have justified attitudes and so on, which we should not abandon, and we shouldn't cede this territory to other branches of philosophy or other parts of academic studies which are outside of philosophy, because they won't do as good a job as we epistemologists will do, because we're used to thinking about topics about getting truth and avoiding error, and we won't think that truth is just social consensus, for example. So it's important to us and to the world we live in that we apply our special skills and reflections from long historical study and sophistication in these matters, that we don't shy away from truth, for example, that we think of this as a distinctive kind of topic and would be treated by a field that is accustomed to dealing with the very tricky issues that arise here. And there are multiple factors that influence these things. And so we shouldn't give it up. But we have to understand the nature of it and understand how it's different from the other branches of epistemology. So anyway, what I was just going to say about the legal case is, just to put a little bit of flesh, like you were doing on the field of testimony. And many of these topics, of course, are discussed by people who do legal theory, but from this particular angle that overlaps with epistemology. And you have a book like a recent book by Larry Loudon, who is formerly a philosopher of science, who definitely says he's doing epistemology, a legal epistemology. That's his label for his efforts in this territory. But they're very much efforts which, if not agreed upon, nonetheless are recognized as belonging in law. So he's been appointed to a position in the University of Texas Law School. So this is a kind of field where, like other parts of epistemology as I conceive of it, there's a lot of interdisciplinary work that's appropriate, but we shouldn't hide its fundamentally epistemological nature. So one topic is about the very fundamental structure of trial systems. So we might think that, well, the Western tradition has one Western tradition for having trials, and other parts of the world have entirely different traditions. But actually, the continental system, where I mean that by that continental Europe, is quite different from the tradition of Anglo-American law, which is descended, of course, mainly from England, but the European system is derived from Roman law. So you've got what's called the civil law tradition, which is the English system, also called the adversarial system. And on the continent, you've got fundamentally, well, what's sometimes called the inquisitorial system, but it's not adversarial in a way I'll explain. So the difference is that the whole organization of a trial on the Anglo-American adversarial system is that the conduct is basically, the initiative for the conduct of the trial is taken by the parties, represented by their attorneys or team of attorneys. And they're the ones who dig up the evidence and defend the position of whichever side they're in, which could be the prosecutors, so the government, or it could be the defendant side. So these adversaries are the two parties as represented by their attorneys, and they seek to introduce evidence. And what the judges do is they decide whether this evidence is admissible or not and can be presented in court. And so they sort of are neutral parties. And then there's a separate trier of fact, which often is a jury, but doesn't have to be a jury. And that's the group that makes a decision about the case. So these are different roles that are played, and they're distinctive in the adversarial system. And the adversarial system can be rationalized as sort of in an epistemic kind of way. The idea is each side gets to have the best evidence presented in its favor, and then some neutral party sort of weighs the evidence. So that's the idea. So each attorney team is supposed to do its best to support its party. Now, it's rather different, actually, in the continental system, where, although nowadays, or in the later development of the system, it's true that there are attorneys, but they play a much more minor role. And basically, all the evidence gathering is done by the judges. In other words, the judges do the investigating. And the judges are also the decision makers. So in other words, they're like the jury. Now, things have gotten more complex in recent years, and there's been a sort of fusion of the system. So on the continent now, you'll sometimes find the jury being a team of professional judges and lay judges combined. Okay? But the purer form is, and I think you might still find this in some kinds of cases on the continent, where it's the judges alone who make the decision. So the question can be asked, well, which of these is better as a total system in terms of getting more accurate judgments? So that's one kind of question. Now, of course, the debates in the American legal system aren't about moving to an entirely different system, but there are debates in the American system, and there are changes made first at the federal level, and then they're often mimicked, but they don't have to be mimicked, at the state level. So there are various rules, and there's, for example, the federal system with respect to the criminal law has a hefty little booklet called the Federal Rules of Evidence, and they govern what kinds of evidence a judge, so it's really instructions to judges, what evidence should you admit and should you not admit. And derivatively, attorneys can come to expect what kinds of evidence will or won't be admitted by judges, who are, of course, going to conform to the federal rules of evidence, lest they be overruled. So other bodies, from time to time, change the rules. And the question is, are the rules all good rules? Now, one can argue about that. And, for example, Loudon in his book argues about that and systematically says that we have far too many principles that allow relevant evidence to be excluded. And the reasons for that are sometimes supposed to be, they're kind of various, but sometimes they're supposed to be epistemic reasons. So you're not allowed to include evidence that would inflame the passions of the jury, for example. Why? Because that's likely to make the jury, so totally convinced when the evidence isn't really that probative. So we gotta, in the interest of getting the truth, we shouldn't allow them even to see that evidence. So that, of course, can be debated. So the question is, which rules will be best from a truth-getting and error-avoiding point of view? Well, that's debatable. But what's the debate? It's not about what a particular jury should decide in a particular case. It's what rules, what institutions should be on the books, because that affects not directly what the jurors aren't supposed to read the federal rules of evidence, but it indirectly affects what pieces of evidence are or are not produced. Among the pieces of evidence that might have been presented in court, it affects the evidence that jurors get. Now, this is a good example of what I'm saying, why institutions and systems are important, because it affects what communications go on, which affects what evidence is presented to people. So that's really important to whether or not people get the truth about things. And that's why our media and the structure and systems of the media are very important, because that affects communications and which communications get made and which do not get made. And for example, things like the ability of corporations to impact on all of our communications by their greater wealth and ability to control media communications, that's real important for what truths people get and don't get ultimately.
Right. I mean, I definitely think that it's important to look at the systems. I mean, I guess I think that that may be one of the reasons why systems, and I think that it is an underexplored area in social epistemology. I think, though, that there is a sense in which it's a natural extension of the second one, where we looked at collective entities. And here are collective entities, not in terms of agents and not in terms of, but just like structural systems that we look at and we evaluate how truth conducive they are. So I think that it's a natural progression, a natural extension. I think that systems qua systems have been underexplored. I just think that it is sort of, I mean, there's some obvious relationships between the two areas.
Well, I think obviously taxonomies you can do in a lot of different ways.
Right. Yeah. No, I think. Yeah.
So I think we've really covered a lot of territory about kinds of things that can be considered social epistemology and why people are applying the trade or working at this subject matter. And
various debates within epistemology and the various kinds of issues that arise.
Right.
So yeah, I think we've given a great a comprehensive overview of the area. There's lots more we could have discussed, but I think that that's a fairly comprehensive picture.
Right.
Okay.
So, that's really fun to talk about.
Yep. Take care, Alvin.
Okay, you too. All right,
Bye-bye.
Jennifer. This was fun. Bye-bye.
Yep, it was fun. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.